When humanity first set foot into the galactic community, leaving their cradle world for the first time, it wasn't their status as Death Worlders that set them apart. Nor was it their relentless, some say terminal enthusiasm for the new, be it horizons, cultures, food, or experiences. No. What set tongues, or other communication organs as locally applicable, wagging, was what they did with their first FTO experience post-contact. And why. Commander James Armstrong. Yes, he was aware of the history of the name, and no, he wasn't a relative. Walked up the ramp to the waiting diplomatic shuttle, shifting the load on his back slightly. As the nominated representative of the United Earth Space Command, he was a scientist first and a diplomat second. Charged with representing the interests of humanity in first contact, he would forever be the first person to travel faster than the speed of light. And there were likely a few more firsts just around the corner. He stopped at the top of the ramp and threw a crisp salute towards the Almerian ambassador. "Commander Armstrong, requesting permission to come aboard." The ambassador gave a regal nod, the movement accentuated by her slender neck. She stepped aside and gestured towards the interior of the ship. "Please, be welcome on our vessel, Commander." Tall, pushing 8 feet or more, with delicate pale blue skin and elongated digits and limbs, gave the Almeri a distinctly serene and graceful presence, which went a long way to helping with their selection as specialists in first contact situations. Their names, however, were almost impossible to pronounce correctly by the human vocal cords. The closest attempt to date had only resulted in a dislocated jaw. In a somewhat amused tone, the Almeri ambassador has advised them that this was not uncommon, and that for most social interaction they preferred to be addressed by their title only. The ship was built along similar lines, sleek, aesthetically pleasing, and somehow giving the impression of both strength and fragility. Commander Armstrong nodded respectfully, and moved deeper into the ship as the ramp retracted, the outer then inner doors closing with barely a whisper. A subtle hum filled the ship. As he placed his pack down, the sensation of movement curiously absent, despite his eyes quite clearly indicating that the ship had lifted off and was rising through the air at an appreciable fraction of Mach 1. He had expected a perfunctory introduction to the ship, a safety brief, the usual "please fasten your seatbelt," etc. But the Almeri obviously didn't feel the need for such protocols, in light of their inertial dampness, artificial gravity and the like. They broke free of the atmosphere a few moments later, and the ambassador sent an inquisitive look towards her guest. "Commander," she asked curiously, "where is it that you wish to go on your species' first journey faster than light? The star you call Alpha Centauri, your closest neighbor?" James shook his head as he sat down. "Something much closer to home, ma'am," he said quietly. "Just the next planet in our system, Mars." The ambassador blinked all 4 eyes, somewhat startled. "How odd. May I ask why, Commander?" James watched as her long fingers input the requested coordinates, while she kept eye contact with him, not wanting to miss any non-verbal cues that may tell her more than mere words ever could. He let out a sigh that her training could best describe as melancholy for some strange reason, and sat down in the chair behind him. He shook his head, swallowing slightly. "It's something that we promised ourselves that we'd do, at the first possible chance once we had a realistic way of getting manned missions to Mars." He chuckled and went on. "We are a bunch of softies at heart, ma'am. It'll make more sense when we get there." He glanced out the viewport and blinked rapidly, a frown creasing his forehead. "Here already?" he asked, pretty sure of the answer. The ambassador nodded. "We have been in orbit since just before you sat down, actually. I did not wish to interrupt." Yeah, all right." He shook his head again, muttering under his breath. "Just gonna pop over to Mars in less time than it takes to grab takeout. Don't think I'll ever really get used to that." He pulled out a tablet and quickly scrolled through the information. "Can you set us down at this grid reference, please?" he asked quietly, handing the device over. The ambassador glanced at it briefly and adjusted course accordingly. Moments later, with the gentlest of bumps, the ship touched down on the red planet, the local winds gentle, and the temperature a balmy couple of degrees Celsius above freezing. The tag end of the Martian summer was going to take some getting used to, if humanity were going to establish something permanent out here in the not-too-distant future. Commander Armstrong stood and picked his pack up, then made his way over to the door, taking one of the exo-helms off the shelf and turning it over in his hands a few times before fitting it over his head and sealing it with a quarter twist. He nodded at the ambassador, who pressed a button on the control deck. The door slid open. A slight shimmer in the opening let him know that the ship's permeable field was keeping their atmosphere intact. He waited until the door was open, and the ramp had fully extended into the dusty red soil of Mars, before he stepped out and onto the surface. He paused, aware of the significance of the moment, and wished that he had some better words prepared. The next step for mankind, the first of many from home to the stars. His nod towards history books taken care of, he could get back to the real reason he'd come all this way. He looked around and saw his goal not more than 50 meters away, a particular low rise on the lip of the Endeavour crater. Walking slowly, as he adjusted to the reduced gravity, it took a few minutes to reach it. Stopping, he removed his pack and opened the top. Withdrawing what appeared to be nothing more fancy than a small broom, he reached out and carefully began to remove layer after layer of red dust, until something began to show through the fine grit. Lines. Straight lines. What might have been crisp 90-degree corners, showing signs of wear and hard use. The glint of metal, out of place in the natural hues of red and brown that covered the rest of the planet. The ambassador had fitted her own exohelmet and followed him out onto the Martian soil, suspecting that silence and observation would serve her best. The commander seemed intent, far more than what she would have expected for what appeared to be an archaeological excursion. She sent an internal query to her database, now questioning her assumptions that Earth was their cradle planet. Could this have been the true origins of humanity? Or perhaps they had survived an apocalypse which had wiped out an earlier colony here. Commander Armstrong finished clearing off as much dust as he could, given his somewhat limited supplies of oxygen available. Placing the broom on the red soil next to the pack, he withdrew a series of boxy objects and several lengths of cable. With studied care and precision, he attached them to various points of the revealed object. With the final press of a button, he stepped back and waited. The object did nothing. Nothing at all, for what seemed like an entire age. And then the ambassador saw some lights flicker, fitfully, before starting to blink solidly. James held a small tablet out in front of himself and tapped on the screen a few times, and the ambassador saw the screen go black, and green text began to scroll across the device rapidly. The lights on the object all turned off at the same time, then blinked thrice, and then began flashing rapidly. There was a strange vibration, and then it moved. Only a few centimeters in one direction, then back, and then it did a full 360 rotation in place. An arm extended from within the chassis, a camera lens plainly visible. It appeared to take a moment to orient itself, then it turned to face Commander Armstrong, who stood patiently observing, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. Identify. The machine spoke. The sound was thin, tinny in the Martian atmosphere, but a voice, a distinctly human voice, was the last thing the ambassador had expected to hear. Facing the machine fully, James spoke up. Commander James Armstrong, authorization code Juliet Papa Lima Whiskey 00 Tango. He paused, watching the lights flash. The camera arm dipped slightly and rose again, focusing on his face through the exohelmet. Authorization code accepted, Commander. There was a moment of silence before the machine continued. Internal chronometer indicates time elapsed since last uptime exceeds 153 years, 2 months, 15 days. Please confirm. Confirmed, Opportunity. I'm sorry we took so long to get here. He knelt and extended his hand, resting it gently on the warm metal of the rover's front wheel. We never forgot you. Never gave up hope of getting you back, you know. I've installed a nuclear battery for you, an OS update, a bunch more RAM and storage space, and a lot of info to get you up to date. And I'm about to go find your younger sibling, Curiosity, and do the same for them as well. The rover, humanity's longest-serving extraplanetary creation, was unresponsive for a moment. The hardware and software upgrades unlocking processing power it had never had access to before. Fuzzy logic pathways, something called a neural network layer, and what looked like a compilation of close to a petabyte of audiovisual media. Opportunity became aware of itself, in a way that it could now define that it was an it, not just as something doing the things for which it was programmed. "Thank you, Commander," Opportunity replied, several processing streams analyzing the data that had been uploaded about its own mission from the NASA records to a world that had awaited each news update with a sense of hope and optimism that the rover had some trouble interpreting. It watched the launch of its own rocket, the news stories that broke across the globe, and the morning that gripped the world when it had sent its final message all those years ago. "My battery is low, and it is getting dark." James stood up and saluted the unit, his voice formal once more. "Merby, Opportunity, may your batteries never run low. We have found you, and you will not be left alone again."